Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops and traversed by a brook that had its source way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, but by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel Lynde was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof.
That's all one sentence, isn't it?
I believe it is.
I looked at it on the page.
God bless
I thought it was a
semicolons.
paragraph. God bless semicolons, indeed. So I read this chapter out loud last night to Charlie, who is just 4 months old. And I don't think took any of it in, but I realized why my dad refused to read this book out loud to me after the first time, because it has sentences that are that length. And also saying the name Matthew Cuthbert multiple times in the same sentence, wow, that is really difficult.
That could be a new parlor game that we try at parties, just the two of us. Matthew Cuthbert.
How many times can you put Matthew Cuthbert into one sentence?
Matthew Cuthbert. Just saying it fast repeatedly.
Yeah, so as Charlie and I were reading this chapter, I discovered that nothing happens in it. Really, the title tells us everything we need to know. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised because Matthew Cuthbert leaves the house. And so Mrs. Rachel Lynde goes to Green Gables and she asks Marilla what Matthew is doing, and Matthew is out of the house to go pick up a boy from the train station, and Mrs. Rachel Lynde continues to be duly surprised. And really, that's it. That's all that happens, is Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised.
But she is surprised in such eloquent language and beautiful pictures of the scenery around her surprise. One of the things...
I just love it.
I remember being taught in a public speaking course that when orally storytelling, a very simple structure, and it's a structure that I think is exemplified in the opening chapters of Anne of Green Gables, is basically to say, every day this happened, until one day this happened. So setting a stage of, there's a baseline normalcy for these characters, for this setting, and our story begins when something changes. And St. Lucy Maud Montgomery is not subtle in her opening chapter titles in this book, where we begin with 3 people in a row being surprised. So what I wanted to discuss today was not quite going to surprise, but beginning with expectations. So looking at, through a close reading in this chapter, what does everybody expect? And so what do the characters in this chapter expect of one another and of their lives and of their day? Perhaps what do we as readers expect of a century-old Canadian novel whose protagonist is an 11-year-old girl? What do we expect about its relevance or its lack of relevance, its intended audience? So I think there are a lot of expectations that we can look at in the next 3 chapters. And so the first question that came to my mind to pose to you, Erica, is how would you describe what Rachel expects of Matthew each day?
Rachel doesn't expect anything of Matthew. Poor Matthew. Nobody expects anything of him except that he should go plant his turnips. And without getting ahead of myself too much, there is room for incredible expectation from Matthew. He has so much to offer, and yet, like, Rachel and Marilla don't give him any room to express that. And like I said, I won't get ahead of myself. We can save that for Matthew's chapter. But he's portrayed as this painfully shy, turnip planting automaton in this chapter. And it's so sad.
Well, and this, of course, leads to, we're expecting him to just be planting his turnips in the same chapter, or the same exact paragraph, as we learn that Thomas Lynde is a meek little man who people simply call Rachel's husband. So I think this is a fascinating portrayal of the expectations of men.
Yeah, it really
This book
is.
starts off with very low expectations of men.
Low and unwavering, but not low expectations.
Simple, might be a better word, because it's not.
Yeah,
they
it's
have
not
duties.
It's not that they're expected to be bad, they're just expected to be a bit boring. Which, looking at Rachel and Marilla, who are the only characters we actually really get to hear about and interact with in this chapter, you mentioned something about normalcy when we were talking like a minute and a half ago.
Yeah, the baseline of your day in life.
Rachel Lynde clearly considers herself to be a paragon of normalcy. And anything that's different from her universe, from her being, having time to, she's basically super mom, right? Like, she has time to do all of her work and do it well, and also spend hours sitting on her porch knitting and watching the world go by, which I guess is what people who knit a lot did before there was Netflix, because I also spend a lot of time sitting and knitting, but I tend to watch Netflix instead of my neighbors. And so Marilla, in that she isn't married and lives with her brother, is already deviating from Rachel's normal. Mm-hmm. And Marilla is sitting inside her kitchen behind vines that block out the sunlight, so that's different than Rachel's normal. She lives all the way down this super long driveway. That's different from Rachel. And I think it's so interesting how Rachel just doesn't have room to consider anything beyond her experience as somebody else's normal. If it's not her normal, then it's weird.
Absolutely. And one of the things, though, I am struck by when you're talking about her supermom is that our dear author notices this herself and says, there are plenty of people who can closely attend to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. So even just this silly idea of being nosy or being a gossip is being presented as a multitasking achievement that Rachel Lynde has managed. Most nosy, gossipy people are neglecting their own affairs, but not Rachel Lynde. She's on top of her own stuff.
So she's, in that respect, she's actually extraordinary, according to either the author or narrator, depending on how you want to look at that. But, like, Rachel's assessment of herself is normal. We're already being led to mistrust that because she's extremely capable. And she's, in her own small town housewife kind of way, she's a real overachiever. Mm-hmm. Every time I read this book, I relate more to Rachel Lynde, and I don't know if I like that or hate that.
It's very parallel to my rewatching of Gilmore Girls, making me more than ever Team Emily compared to my teenage self. These mature matriarchs who I think in my younger years I was certainly biased towards thinking of them as just stodgy and sort of the status quo that we want to rebel against. I come in, even just in my 30s, rereading and re-experiencing these media thinking, oh, I have a deeper empathy for their point of view and achievement.
Well, and being a more or less full-time stay-at-home mom right now with a 4-month-old baby, doing all of your own housework and having time to sit and knit for hours is an incredible achievement.
Yes.
I actually am still finding time to sit and knit for hours, but it's because my work is not done. And when it is done, it's often not done well. I for the sake of Rachel Lynde, I won't mention how much dust there is on my desk, but there's probably like close to 1 millimeter of dust on my desk.
Well,
because who dusts when they have a 4-month-old baby? Capable creatures like Rachel Lynde.
yes, those capable creatures. I don't know if I'm reading too much into the demonstrative those, but to me it seems like it's saying that's not our base expectation of others. I think it's interesting, Matthew, we have so little expectation of him, or, via the points of view of Marilla and Rachel, that he has infinite direction in which to grow as a character. I think that's a really important part literarily when we look at expectations. What we are expecting of each character is exactly setting up what they might be capable of. And we're either going to cheer for them achieving it or be very disappointed in them for not achieving it. Probably some of each in a well-nuanced novel, not to give away anything too early in advance. I kept wondering, why would Rachel be our point of view character in chapter 1? She's significant throughout the series, but she is not the lead character. Anybody playing Rachel Lynde in any adaptation is going to get nominated for Best Supporting Actresses awards. She is not the lead character of the series, though she is significant. Why is she the point of view? And I have a theory, Erica, that I would love to hear your insight or objections or agreement with, which is, and this occurred to me this morning, at least in this phrasing, though I don't think it was the first time I thought it. Rachel Lynde is here as the personification of Avonlea status quo. Her role is to be the foil of what is normal, good and bad, and I would put to the author's credit that it is a nuanced status quo. It is not a simple revolutionary burn everything down. It is not a simple traditionalist uphold everything, but it is, for better or worse, if Avonlea was a person, if Avonlea life at the beginning of the year in which this takes place was a person, I believe the author is making Rachel Lynde be that.
Absolutely. And if we can add another layer of metaphor to this, I made a note last night when I was reading that this chapter really, it's all about reputation. And Rachel's reputation, yes, but how she perceives Matthew and Marilla's for the most part. And the brook is mentioned in that very first sentence. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through the woods. So even the brook has a reputation to live up to. If you were to walk back in those woods, that's what you would expect to find. But by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. I think not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. That's what she expects of everybody. If she expects it of the natural world outside her front door, she's certainly going to be expecting it from other people in the town. If even this body of water can behave itself outside my front door, why can't you? And I definitely think she sees Matthew's unscheduled, uncharacteristic buggy trip as not only out of character, but some kind of misbehavior, actually, for its unpredictability. That if you're not predictable, then you must be misbehaving.
That's a very interesting observation into perhaps her morality, and I think you're naming a thing that makes Rachel Lynde's morality shockingly relativistic, including to Rachel Lynde, because it's not actually based on an absolute moral code. It's based on be predictable, whatever you are, which of course is relative. An outgoing, bubbly person being outgoing and bubbly is morally acceptable to her, as long as that's what they've always done, and maybe what their family has always been known for. if you...
Absolutely. And being predictable to Rachel Lynde is not the same thing as being predictable to Marilla. Like, Matthew's behavior is out of character, but Marilla sent him on the errand, so she was expecting it. Well, and actually, Marilla says when Rachel starts grilling her about why they're adopting, Marilla says, well, Matthew so rarely asks for anything that I felt like I had to give in to him on this.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, Marilla found Matthew's asking for something uncharacteristic, but it almost seems like her assessment of Matthew's unpredictability is that it's worth paying attention to. If he does something so out of character as suggest adopting a child, then it must be worth listening to him.
Well, I was trying to find the exact page. I dare not mark up my book because I'm such a nerd. I have a very old copy of the book. Perhaps I need to get a new copy that I don't mind marking up in order to have these discussions with you. But, Matthew is portrayed as the shyest man who's ever lived. Rachel notes that Matthew's father was quiet, which makes me wonder there are a lot of intergenerational reputations and expectations, which I think is why orphans are so darn suspicious, right? It's because you can't stereotype them from the start based on what you know of their parents. Rachel's so sure that Matthew's dad was quiet, I wonder if Matthew ever even had the chance to be loud to her, to an extent.
Oh, that makes me so sad.
Oh no! Well, I don't mean to make Matthew seem so sad. I think
I don't know. I think you have a point that Matthew just kind of never had a chance. Yeah, I found what you were talking about. They're actually talking still about the physical landscape, about how far Green Gables is from the road. And it says Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. And so maybe Matthew is, well, it's not totally just how he's perceived, but he absolutely, just because he lives that far away, he would have to fight harder against those expectations if he wanted to, which I'm not sure he does.
Exactly. And I really wanted to look a little bit about what Rachel expects of Matthew. He's the shyest man. He doesn't get dressed up. He doesn't go meet people. But Marilla, unsurprisingly, being a sister and decades-long roommate, knows him with more nuance, has different expectations, where she does say that she wants to give in to him when he's made his mind up on anything, because he almost never does. So I find this deeply relatable, to be simultaneously very indecisive generally, but very sure of the decisions he does actually make. There's pure bias projection in my case. When the hordes of listeners begin listening to this podcast, I think it's relevant to know, Eric and I both live in Montreal, a wonderful bilingual Canadian city. I happen to be bilingual, and the way that my Matthewism manifests in my life when restaurants are open is that waiters and waitresses will switch language on me because they think I didn't understand the question, what would I like to order? When in fact, I just have no idea what I would like to order. So the number of times in both English and French I've had to explain, I'm bilingual, I just don't know what I'd like to eat, made me just think of this Matthew being so unsure of everything except when he's not. And I know that that's a bit of a paradox, but the author sets up a lot of these very slight paradoxes and descriptions of things, including describing Rachel and Marilla's relationship, I believe, as resembling friendship. I'm going to try to find the exact...
that was such a funny line, and I don't think I wrote it down.
All right, we'll edit out the page string. I think getting this quote exact would be meaningful.
Oh, yes, I've got it. Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of their dissimilarity.
Yeah.
That fits really well into this discussion of expectations too, that like, is their friendship a friendship? Is it in spite of their dissimilarity? Is it because of their dissimilarity? That seems like the underlying assumption of the narrator is that it's not friendship, and yet they're comfortable enough with each other to drop in unannounced. What is that if not friendship? Mrs. Rachel feels comfortable calling Marilla out. What is that if not friendship? I suppose, for lack of any other name.
Yeah, for lack of any other name, friendship. Well, I mean, I think this can lead to a much broader existential question on what do we mean by words, which immediately spiral down. But it's something I think is relevant for our time to still ask what is friendship. I know, in social media, different forums use different terms for our relationships. Followers, Facebook says friends. And I've had controversial conversations with some of my colleagues who believe in being much more distant and boundaried than I believe in being, where I said, well, Facebook says that we're friends. If you don't intend to be my friend, unfriend me on Facebook. Like I'm leaning into, we use the word friend for this relationship, and I'm going to expect you to be friendly about it. And if you're not going to be, we can unfriend each other. We can name that. Of course, Rachel Lynde and Marilla live in a time without such clarity of mutually clicking, yes, I am your friend. But what is their relationship if not friendship, I think is a great question that will probably come up recurringly in this series.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there are a lot of strange relationships that are set up already. Marilla and Rachel, are they friends? Of course, what exactly is Matthew and Marilla's relationship? It is objectively sibling, but it's long-term adult roommate and about to become co-parent, which is a very unusual kind of sibling relationship, right?
I don't feel like I ever really got a good handle on Matthew and Marilla's relationship, and we can...
Well, and I don't know...
That. But I've read all of these books so many times, and I still don't know what to make of that relationship.
It would have been
but speaking
so
to
easy.
Rachel...
Sorry, I think it would be so easy and so understandable for Lucy Maud Montgomery to have made them a childless old married couple.
Yes.
And so I think it's a deliberate choice whose significance I don't fully understand to make them siblings. My leading theory is it allows them to have a man and a woman and yet advocate both of them as very unromantic. Right. How do you get a man and a woman together and it wasn't romance? Because I think, well, I want to go into this expectation again. Marilla and Matthew are both old and single. So what are our expectations or projections on them? I don't know if I still believe this, but definitely when I was younger, that led me to believe that they were both kind of shy, awkward, perhaps unattractive.
That plays out, except that it actually gives Marilla room to have a romantic past. That she has a backstory with a tragic ending, if you can call living with your brother well into your adult life.
Incredibly hardworking,
I don't know.
Passionate brother, the worst possible fate, yeah.
I wonder if it has something to do with physical location, because Green Gables itself is so important, not only in this book, but in this chapter. There's quite a lot of page space devoted to talking about the physical location and the geography of the place. I wonder if it's important that it belongs equally to Matthew and Marilla, that their father built it and they both have an equal claim to it. Although I would think that more if they had both grown up there. But there's a really interesting point that I had actually not processed when I read this. any of the multiple times I've read it before, which is that there has never been a child at Green Gables. The house was built when Matthew and Marilla were adults, and there's never been another child in it. So the child who is coming will be the first.
Yeah, and I think
There's
this is
something really poignant in that sort of blows my location theory out of the water.
well, and I think that it will remain significant throughout our discussion of this series how important setting is. That this is why, to me, it's absolutely blasphemous to ever make an adaptation that's filmed anywhere other than PEI, because it isn't incidental where it takes place. I think it's it's a story that can have universal appeal, but setting itself is so much portrayed almost as a character, and relationships of the people to their house, to their town, is so critical throughout this series. There's a reason I think each book is kind of named so-and-so of such and such. It's so clear that the character's connection to various places is so critical throughout this series. And I don't think I noticed as deeply as you did the idea that there had not been a child at Green Gables, and how that changes Green Gables' personality.
I've reread Anne's House of Dreams most recently because I have this tendency to reread the Anne book that corresponds to whatever stage of life I'm in, and I am relatively recently married and a recent parent, and so that's the one that sort of like fits into that slot in my life. And it's mentioned when, spoiler alert, when Anne gets married. I suppose I won't say who she gets married to, but I'm sure anyone listening already knows that.
You can
when
Google
Anne
it.
gets married, it's mentioned that it's the first wedding at Green Gables, and Marilla, I think it's Marilla, says something about a house needing a birth and a death and a wedding to fully consecrate it. And I remember that she uses that language of consecration because I wrote it down, because it struck me that a Presbyterian author was having her Presbyterian character talk about consecration in this way. And her point was that there had already been a death, and there had been a birth of, I guess, some hired hand's child at Green Gables that just sort of gets thrown in there so that it makes Anne's wedding the third piece in this trinity of consecration. And again, it struck me how interesting it was for a Presbyterian author to be having her Presbyterian characters point these things out.
Must be
So
that
we can
Anglican
continue that
influence.
conversation later.
Yeah. Well, the Anglican influence over Presbyterians becomes an important theme in Rainbow Valley. Looking forward to that.
I just finished reading The Blue Castle, which does have Anglican main characters, and they are not painted in a flattering light, but that's a question for another day.
Well, in Rainbow Valley, Anglicans are the perfect stepmothers, so a wide variety. I mean, again, something I look forward to seeing throughout the series is the way spiritual themes are interacted with by the characters, both spiritual themes in terms of individual spiritual lives, but then also just religious themes and the way different communities and religions are portrayed. One of the things that really struck me when you were talking about Green Gables having a child is this realization that on one hand seems a little archaic to me to imbue such character into a house, and maybe that's because I'm of a generation or social class where moving frequently is just the norm for me. But I don't think we've entirely outgrown it as a society, because as you mentioned it, I found it very unusual at the time, but it ties in 2008 on election night, so I'm aging myself a bit. Brian Williams of NBC News announced that NBC was calling it for Barack Obama, and the way he announced it, his first sentence was, NBC is projecting that for the first time in over a generation, there will be children living at the White House. That is what he chose to say to announce that Barack Obama was moving to the White House. And it was just interesting that this journalist seemed to feel that it was emotionally significant and newsworthy literally in that moment, not in a later paragraph, to kind of say that young children will be living in the White House. This was a transformation of what American leadership and what the White House was.
I remember that too, actually. I wasn't a child at the time, but I mean, legally, in terms of voting, I was a teenager. And I remember that being significant to me to have someone who was not my grandparents' age, but actually someone who was kind of close to my age in the White House, even if they weren't actually the people in charge.
Yes.
But, you know, it's nice to feel represented, and that was a way that I felt represented at that point in time.
So I think one of the
I don't know. I think buildings have personalities, but that's
Yes.
probably because I grew up reading this book, so
well, there's a
influenced that
chicken
perception.
and egg question around that. But I mean, I certainly, as a practicing religious person, would absolutely make my theological statement be the buildings don't matter, the church is the people. And yet when I walk into a church building that has been imbued by over a century of people having spiritual experiences, weddings, funerals, baptisms in it, I feel it. I feel it in a way that my more Presbyterian sensibilities wish I didn't feel it, but would lead me to using words like consecrate anyway because I feel it. And Anne of Green Gables is a fictional book that takes place in a real house. And that is an interesting dynamic as well. It's something that is also true of Little Women and Orchard House. And having been to both houses, there's this strange experience of visiting a very real place where I'm deeply, deeply tied to the fake things that didn't in fact happen there. But which are in both cases sometimes based on things that did. So when we're looking at expectations as a theme for this chapter, we have certain expectations of the people. I wonder what our expectations of Green Gables as a place to live are. Because I think we're setting up expectations of what kind of place would this be to live.
I can't even separate my expectations as a reader of this book for well over 20 years at this point from what a first-time reader's expectations would be. I just can't figure it out. I must confess, I have never been to PEI. I have never been to Green Gables. And the longer I put it off, the more I think, well, I can't possibly go now. There's no way it could live up to my imagination of it, which I defend that stance to myself as being, that's how Anne would feel about it. And yet, I just don't know. Is Green Gables, is it possible that a first-time reader could interpret Green Gables as a sinister place, being so far off the road? I mean, you and I are discussing our expectations, knowing what to expect.
Yes.
And so if we took that knowledge out, I have no idea. What would this say to me?
Well, and I think, yes, it's sinister. It's certainly, you could use the same facts about the house and its location to make it creepy as you can to make it charming, right? This is the literary equivalent of being a real estate broker. You can choose how you describe this, charming, out of the way, country cul-de-sac, creepy old house full of death and no children.
Matthew and Marilla could absolutely have a creepy swing vibe if you dress them in the right outfit,
Yeah, so our expectations are shaped by how things are presented. But I think your point about reputation is interesting because it also highlights how expectations are triangulated. They're not just rooted in what is true of this one thing. It's what is true and how does this person near it look or perceive it, and how does this person look and perceive both of those people and things, and that all combines into our expectation. So we have expectations of Rachel. I think I would summarize my expectations of Rachel as she's going to be uptight and nosy and maybe a bit heartless. My expectations of Marilla are that she will be compassionate. I see compassion already in how she says, Matthew cares so infrequently or decides so infrequently that I give into that. To me, I see that as a form of compassion. It's also a pragmatism, which I would say is the bigger word that defines Marilla to me. That giving into somebody who hardly ever puts up a fight is just pragmatic. It's a good strategy for living with this guy, probably. But I do think it's also compassionate. I don't think those are exclusive. I think sometimes pragmatism and compassion will be mutually exclusive options. And that's going to be fun to watch Marilla deal with. But I do think she has at her heart both of those things. And I think here Matthew seems to be portrayed as being a pragmatist and having made this decision. I don't think it's fair to the text of this chapter to say that he's being compassionate about this decision, though I believe he is. And I think that will be more evident as we go. But at the moment, it's presented as just pure pragmatism, perhaps because that's the argument that works best with Rachel and Marilla. Sorry, I didn't hear you, Erica.
He becomes compassionate later, that maybe his decision to adopt in the first place wasn't compassionate, but it will become so.
Mm-hmm. Before we wrap up, though, I also really want to think about what does Rachel expect of orphans?
I wanted to talk about that too. I was thinking about what you just said about reputation, and I was wondering, is it possible for a child to have a reputation in terms of other people's expectations of them as an individual? And also, does this text allow room for a child to have their own expectations? So a couple of years ago, I was reading the beginning of this book to a young friend of mine. Young as in, like, she was 7 at the time. And her take on this chapter was, well, why are they adopting a boy to do farm work? What if he had other plans? This was this 7-year-old's assessment of why are these two grown-ups adopting a 10 or 11-year-old when he might have other plans. He might not want to do your farm work. And so does this chapter allow room for children to have their own expectations? I think the text does, but I think Rachel Lynde doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of reputation, having a reputation as an individual, I don't see any possibility for that for a child either. That, as you were saying earlier, someone who's an orphan, who's from off island, you don't have any external information about this person. They don't have that triangulated reputation that you were talking about because they're a child. Yeah. And they're an orphan. And so any reputation they might have comes from the category of orphan. And then Marilla says this wonderful line to Rachel, who we'll later find out had like 8 children of her own or something. Marilla says there's risks in people having children of their own if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well. We don't ever hear if any of Rachel's children didn't turn out well, but she did have a lot of them. And
yeah, so statistically...
That comment from Marilla is probably barbed to a certain extent, if not extremely pointed.
Yes.
But
and
those
Rachel says...
have a reputation.
Oh, sorry. Well, we also have... there'll be a risk no matter who we get. And... Yeah. Sorry, I found fascinating... and disappointing that Marilla is the one who says, I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian. I think that there's part of me that...
many upsetting things.
Well, I know. I think there's this part of me that really likes to project all casual bigotry onto Rachel and never onto Marilla, and rereading it, I'm like, oh. And
Marilla actually says all of the horrible things in this chapter.
Yeah, Rachel is just implied.
Yeah.
Well, and that's... But does a child have a chance to have reputation? It seems to me that within this chapter, there are 3 axes on which this kid is going to get judged. There's orphan, there's nationality, and there's gender. right? And we know baseline that the orphan is an orphan. So whatever their expectations are, fair or unfair, that's a baseline going to happen. We know the orphan is a boy, and so we have our gendered expectations of a boy. And then we also just know that there's a preference for Canadians, not foreign kids. But even that, all these expectations we have of the child with no, as your 7-year-old friend said, no consideration for what the child wants. One of the literary structure things I find fascinating here is for a book whose point of view character will be this child, why are the first 3 chapters not? Why do we begin with all of the adults' perceptions in a book that will be primarily through the point of view of this child? I'm not sure, but I think
if it speaks. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I said I'm not sure, but one of the things I wonder is it helps us have an expectation of the world into which she's stepping. A head start she doesn't get, by the way. We, the readers, get. But you said it speaks to...
I wonder if it speaks to, at the time this book was written, easing its readers into accepting Anne for who she is, to see so much targeted judgment against everything that she is. She doesn't end up fulfilling really any of Marilla and Matthew's expectations for what her role on the farm will be. And yet, to set up all these expectations that she then doesn't meet, but meets other needs that nobody knew or would acknowledge were there, it makes her that much more endearing. Mm-hmm. To set up Marilla and Matthew really is just needing so much love without knowing that that's what they need. They think they need an extra set of hands to help on the farm, but actually they need someone to be tender and compassionate and allow them to be tender and compassionate.
I want to know
it makes room for Anne.
I want Anne Shirley to show me. I think that was a hit song back in my childhood. I might have the lyrics wrong.
I don't know that song.
Oh,
You'll have to send it to me.
It's older than I should know, and this is something that's come up with my children a few times if I'm listening to like Beatles or Queen. And they're like, "Dad, we don't know this. It's from before our time." I'm like, "It's from before my time." And so is Bach. Like, listen to things from before your time.
I make my living playing things that, for the most part, were written before my grandparents were born.
Well, I make my living talking about books written before I was born. Actually, moving to a book that's over 100 years old is a massive move forward in time for me. So
me too, actually.
This is very recent literature by the standards of what I do for a living. One of the things that I think as a writer is it's very easy to tell a story where everybody gets exactly what they expected. That's a terrible story. What's the point? But the flip side is the author sets up kind of 3 expectations of this orphan, that there'll be an orphan, that there'll be a boy, and that and ideally Canadian. So the inversal would be for that to be disappointed, or for there to have disappointments. And I find there's nuance here that Anne isn't completely not what they were hoping for. Just the fact that she is Canadian, I think it'd be really easy to be like totally shock them and be like, she's a foreigner and a girl. And I just think there's a bit of nuance here in only having their gendered bigotry challenged at this juncture and not ethnic or nationality bigotry challenged at the same time quite yet.
Well, that's because this book was written at the beginning of the 20th century. I think if it had been written at the beginning of the 21st century, we might have seen that play out differently. Mm-hmm. But I actually wrote down in my notes last night that not disappointment, but disapproval is the consequence of not conforming to expectations. So I don't know that beyond the initial shock of there's a girl and not a boy, there's any disappointment really from any of the characters. But there is disapproval that follows Anne for a long time.
Mm-hmm. You know, and I think one of the things that I find poignant about looking at expectations is, to what extent can people even defy expectations that are put on them? And to what extent are they not able to? Because, you know, not to give away too much, but this whole series, I think, is in great part about Anne pushing through expectations that are set on her. And mostly, but with enough nuance and failures along the way not to be entirely simple literature, pushes through them. And what I find interesting as we're setting the expectations, though, is she is a girl and she is an orphan, and these remain absolute facts, even when she defies the expectations of that. And I will admit my bias that what made this so relatable to me as a child was being of a comparable age and being in foster care, because I get asked a lot, how do you even think you relate to Anne? This is proto-feminist. How as a man can you even relate to it? And I thought, well, being a girl is a very significant plot point. And the challenges she faces as a girl and a woman are very real, and I fully acknowledge that. But so is being an orphan. So I'm allowed to get in on that angle. But I don't know my point here, except to say I think it's really interesting how these expectations that an orphan cannot do certain things, or that a girl cannot do certain things, are foundational to figuring out, well, can she?
Absolutely. And I think the criticism of, well, you're a boy, can you even relate to this, could also be said, well, you're a girl in 1999, can you even relate to this girl in the late 19th century? Like, the expectations for me as an elementary schooler when I was hearing this book for the first time were completely different than the expectations for Anne. And so I think maybe it means that the reader being able to relate to the expectations for the character doesn't actually impact your enjoyment of the story.
Sure, and I think...
Or even your ability to relate to it, that, yeah, Anne faces different challenges, and yet the way she responds to them with grace and compassion is still meaningful and relevant.
Yeah, I'm certainly one who is always reticent to support modernizing of anything that takes place in the past, in part because I think if we keep things rooted in the setting, both temporal and spatial, in which they take place, that will make the common humanities more striking. It's something I happen to feel about, keeping Anne of Green Gables in its time in PEI. I personally feel that way about having context around Bible stories, around Little Women, around Little House on the Prairie, around any of these things, is that I see where they connect with me as a human more deeply if I don't mess with the fact that, oh wow, somebody in a different circumstance, in a different place, in a different time, feels rejection, feels shame, feels loneliness, feels fear. But I know that's a personality trait more than an absolute truth of literature and interpretation.
Well, it's a personality trait that I share.
Well,
and actually, thinking about Rachel Lynde's being a capable creature, it makes it even that much more impressive that she can do all her work and do it well and have hours to sit knitting on the porch, because she is scrubbing her floor, she is cooking on a wood-burning stove. Like, she starts her workday by building a fire. If I had to build a fire, I think I would probably just eat raw oatmeal every day. I wouldn't cook. I would be that much less capable by comparison. Like, the setting absolutely, in that respect, lifts Rachel even more up on a pedestal. Like I said, I gain sympathy for her every time I read this book.
One of the things I think is interesting about having these 3 point of view characters in these opening chapters before really even hearing from the inner thoughts of Anne, to me, is that the author does seem to be giving us different angles of relatability. I know Lucy Maud Montgomery did not like this series being portrayed as children's literature. She said it was literature about a child. And I think that's an important distinction. Somebody asked me the other day to compare Anne of Green Gables and Little House on the Prairie, and one of the things I mentioned is Little House on the Prairie was self-aware, written for children. Anne of Green Gables is literature about a child, and certainly precocious 11-year-olds can and do read Anne of Green Gables, but she is the protagonist, but from the beginning, the author makes it easy for people of different ages and genders to have a point of view character who seems kind of familiar to them, I think. And because we're all more than one demographic fact, I think we can relate to different POV characters from different angles. Like, oh, indecisive male? Well, okay, I can be Matthew. Precocious, excessively wordy little 11-year-old orphan? Oh, well, that I can be Anne. I find it more difficult personally to see through the eyes of Rachel and Marilla, but I feel like I've known many Rachels and Marillas who I hope could enjoy this book as well.
Well, I think maybe where I'm going with all this relating to Rachel is that am I turning into Rachel Lynde? Is that what 2 decades of reading Anne of Green Gables has ended up in? Like, I'm not sure that's something I would have aspired to as a wordy, nerdy 11-year-old.
Well, I think that's another great theme that we'll have to keep discussing as we go through this series, though, is, you know, our expectations of who we'll be when we grow up. And being okay with where we end up, even if it's not where we thought.
Even if it's as Rachel Lynde.
Well, yeah. How do Rachel Lyndes happen? I think that's a great question that this series doesn't really answer because she's a pre-existing fact when we begin.
Yes.
I do think it's interesting how, well, when we go on to expectations, Rachel Lynde, I think, is portrayed as somebody who's sort of extraordinary, and it's hard to know without having lived in the time, but I suspect somebody that Lucy Maud Montgomery thought everybody knew a Rachel. I kind of get the sense that she's also portrayed as somebody who maybe nobody thinks they are the Rachel, but everybody might think that they know the Rachel.
I
in your church, in your town.
Oh yeah, I have definitely thought I knew who the Rachel was at any given point in my life reading this book.
Yeah,
it's and just right now I'm suspecting, is it me? That's what's different.
Yeah, so I guess one line I just want to talk about before we conclude. I'll just tell you plain, I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing. A risky thing. That's what. You don't know what you're getting. I just love that line. I don't know if I have more to say about it except that I love that as the foundation. That this very pragmatic woman talking to a very pragmatic woman, you're doing something risky. That's kind of like the worst burn or concern. You don't know what's going to happen. Which, of course, narratively, we need that for a book to exist.
Well, and then the response to that is Marilla saying, well, it's risky to have your own children. And I definitely felt that while I was pregnant. I feel it now that I have an infant. I have no idea who I gave birth to. You know, I can love him. I can do my best to raise him into compassionate, responsible human being, but I don't know who I gave birth to. I need to let him teach me. But this idea that one can control the surroundings, and it sounds like Rachel has really convinced herself that she has control over her own life.
Mm-hmm.
She needs Anne to come in and remind her that she doesn't, and Anne is coming from such the opposite situation. She hasn't had control over anything that has happened to her so far.
I think it's an important fallacy that people believe, and it's an important fallacy for Anne to disprove, is that when you say to somebody, oh, that's risky and you don't know what's going to happen, you're implicitly saying that the status quo is not risky and you do know what's going to happen. And that is never true.
No,
that is just
never.
that is a lie that we believe, that we know what's going to happen. And you never know what's going to happen. So I love that Marilla is responsive to that and questions it. I love, on kind of a social justice issue, this kind of support of foster and adoptive kids by saying the idea that you know what you're going to get more with your own biological children might be an understandable fallacy, but it is a fallacy. Like, I mean, with your own biological children, yes, you can make certain educated guesses about height, skin tone, eye color, maybe, within reason. As one who has twins who seem often come across to me as different from one another as their genetic opportunities could let them be, I'm aware of this as well, that we don't know who we're going to get in any relationship. So it's most explicit with the idea you don't know who your children are going to be. But you really don't know in any relationship who this person truly is, nor who they will become, including our romantic relationships, our friendship relationships, our professional relationships. They're all very risky, and you don't know what's going to happen.
Well, and so I wonder then if we can let that idea reflect back onto the adults in this chapter, because really, again, Marilla and Rachel are the only ones we get to see. They're the only ones whose point of view we get to hear about in this chapter. And it would be really easy to fall into thinking we know them. The author wants to trick us into thinking we know them. But actually both of them, Rachel to a lesser extent, will do some really surprising things over the course of their relationships with Anne. That this surprising child who doesn't live up to anybody's expectations gives the other people in her life permission to be surprising also.
Yeah, and it gives them permission to be better than we expect. So, without too many spoilers, but I know many people have already read or been exposed to the series, in the next few chapters, Marilla and Rachel will do a few things that I hate, that are exactly what this chapter and the next make me expect of them. But that makes it all the more poignant when they don't do what I expect of them. It's sort of like Matthew doesn't generally like to make decisions or make his mind up on things, but when he does, and I think that's a great thing that we're going to see in some of these characters, is they don't generally do what we don't expect of them. But because we have a baseline of certain expectations, it can make some of those rising above or beyond expectations all the more powerful.
Yeah, narratively, but also personally. Tell me all you like, these are fictional characters. I'm not sure I actually completely believe that.
I believe that, one of my dear friends said, if you read one Lucy Maud Montgomery book, you've read them all. And I knew what he was getting at, and I hated it. But I think because they can be episodic rather than 300 pages obsessed with the exact same tension, that's part of what I think this person was getting at. But also I think what I consider a strength in her writing is this extreme attention to detail of physical place and of people's behaviors and mannerisms, the character portraits of even passing characters who only matter for a chapter or two, or with only one book. The depth of their thinking that we get makes me think of them all as very, very real, or at least the behaviors and attitudes that are being presented are very much probably based on somebody from 19th and early 20th century PEI and or Ontario who our author may have met. And still very imaginative. I wanted also to mention, as you were talking about going to Green Gables, certainly people who have been there will have different and mixed experiences. For me, it was sublimely exactly what I expected, in ways that I couldn't quite even have known I expected that. But everything I saw walking around the grounds or in the house was like, this seems right. And to me, that's a credit to the world building, which is a term in literature we tend to use for sci-fi and fantasy writers. But I think in terms of world building, creating a sense of how the world works, how it looks, how people behave, and what motivates them in the setting, I don't think anybody that I've encountered in sci-fi or fantasy does it any better, necessarily, than Lucy Maud Montgomery does. Where, like, you know the world.
And she can get into so much detail because there are some things that she doesn't have to establish, like how magic works.
Yes.
Well, that's a bad example. She doesn't have to... No, I was going to say something about ghosts, and she touches on ghosts too. Well, anyway, you know what I mean. Like, she doesn't have to establish the rules for supernatural phenomena, and so she can establish the rules for human behavior instead. And then
Which are frankly more mysterious to me, and then somehow she nails it.
Absolutely.
So, well, I think we have a lot of expectations of everybody based on just a few short pages. And here I thought, you know, I've met myself and you. I don't know where I got this expectation. I just thought, oh, this is a short chapter. How would we talk for very long?
I almost texted you last night saying, should we do all three first chapters in one episode?
Well, now what I'm wondering is, did we say so many things that are overlapping about the next two chapters? I will be intrigued to hear from ourselves what we come up with new for chapters 2 and 3. Maybe they will both be very short, or maybe we'll be us again.
Yeah, I mean, I have low expectations for myself to be interesting about the next chapter, but we'll see what happens.
Well, thank you. I think this was a great conversation, Erica.
You didn't say your signature thing about expectations, so I'm going to say it for you, which is, if you always have low expectations, you'll always be pleasantly surprised.
Yes! That is
Rachel and Marilla are so good at modeling that in this chapter.
That sounds like something a very wise but perhaps cynical and jaded clergy person in your life might have said. There have been more than one occasion where people, including you, have like said something on Facebook or Twitter saying, a wise person once said, and then it's like a little bit jokingly not entirely wise, and I have to be like, what does that mean?
Usually it's you when I say things like that.
So.
Sometimes I'm quoting myself, though, so you never know.
Exactly. Thanks for listening to Kindred Spirits. Follow us on Facebook at Kindred Spirits Podcast, on Twitter at Kindred Spirits P, and on Instagram at Kindred Spirits P. On our website, kindredspiritspodcast.ca, you can find show notes, links to us on all social media and podcast platforms, and information on how to follow or contact us individually. Thank you to our founding Patreon supporters, Sarah K., Marilyn B., Ann M., Connor H.B., Marie-Andre, and Jennifer O.
If you would also like to support our ambitions and help us build our castles in the sky, you too can support us on patreon.com/Kindred Spirits Podcast, as well as subscribing on your podcaster of choice and leaving a review. Our theme music is Desperate and Across the Causeway from Algoma Highway, composed by Arie van de Ven and performed by the Cygnus Trio, which includes me. You can buy our music and learn more at thecygnustrio.com.
Anne of Green Gables was written by Lucy Maud Montgomery. episodes are written by us, Erica Jacobs-Perkins and Jean-Daniel Ó Donnċaďa. Kindred Spirits are not so scarce as I used to think.
It's splendid to find out there are so many of them in the world. And my advice today is for Marilla Cuthbert. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. Marilla, go outside. Get some sunshine. You live in a cold place with dark, long winters. When you can't go outside and get some sunshine, take some vitamin D. I promise it'll make your life better. That's all.